I was 63 years old the morning the Kethani fleet began to move, and I had been waiting for that morning since I was 19, not in the way a young soldier waits, not with clenched hands and prayers and borrowed courage. I had waited the way my commanding officer taught me to wait, the way his commanding officer had taught him, the way the whole chain of quiet women and men, stretching back through 2 centuries of occupation, had learned to wait. Patience that looked exactly like submission, and with discipline that never once broke cover. The Kethani had been on this world for 50,000 years by their own accounting. They arrived when our ancestors were still learning the shape of fire, and they stayed because it cost them nothing to stay. Earth was a way station, a resource depot, a footnote in their administrative ledger, a planet of small, slow creatures who had never once, in all that remembered time, presented a problem large enough to demand attention. They had taken what they wanted across the millennia, reshaped coastlines for their logistics, hollowed mountains for their transit tunnels, seeded their orbital infrastructure across the sky like constellations. And when Earth's people grew complex enough to notice, the Kethani simply redefined the relationship. They called it governance. They called it order. They called it, at various points across the centuries, by a dozen different words that all meant the same thing. You are ours, and we have decided not to finish you. What they never understood, what they had built 50,000 years of certainty on top of not understanding, was that we had decided something too. I will not tell you the decision was easy or clean or made by heroes. The Valdran Compact is what historians call the network of underground agreements that survived across 216 years of occupation, was made by frightened people in insufficient light. I have read the founding records. The first meetings was 7 individuals in a sealed maintenance corridor beneath the Karen Basin Transit Hub, arguing in whispers about whether what they planned was possible or whether it was only the kind of plan that sounds like hope and ends like a massacre. They chose to believe it was possible. They chose to begin, and then they chose to tell no one except the next link in the chain, and the next for 200 years, in every bunker and workshop and buried relay station on the planet. What they built, in that silence, was the Valdran Shelf Aegis. I did not know its full scope until the morning it activated. That was by design. The Compact had understood, in ways that I find almost unbearable to contemplate now, that the Kethani did not need to intercept a plan. They only needed to intercept a single person who knew the whole of it. So no single person ever did. I knew my section. 41 relay nodes buried along the northern Karen ridgeline, installed over 30 years, disguised as seismic monitoring infrastructure, each one drawing power from geothermal taps the Kethani had laid themselves. I knew my 41 nodes. I knew the 3 other people in my cell who knew the same 41 nodes. I did not know what waited in the Valdres Deep Shelf, or the Marian Plateau, or the 9 orbital clusters, whose construction had been folded into Kethani-approved maintenance schedules for longer than my grandmother had been alive. I knew only what I was told to know, and I waited. The Kethani began their withdrawal on a Tuesday, which is the kind of mundane detail that history books tend to leave out. Their authority had announced it 14 months prior. A reallocation of administrative resources, a strategic consolidation, tidying of the ledger. Earth would be reclassified. The occupation in their terminology would be concluded. Earth had been assembling in high orbit for 6 weeks. 9 carriers, 4 support vessels, the great barge hulks that carried the infrastructure they were taking with them. The morning I am describing, they began to move those hulks into withdrawal formation. The Kethani administrators on the surface were in the 3rd day of their departure, processing. Everything from where they stood was proceeding according to their schedule. It was not proceeding according to their schedule. At 06143 local time, my commanding officer sent me a single-word message through the agricultural relay system we had been using as a courier channel. 11 years. The word was the name of a bird that does not exist. A code word so old its origin had been lost before I was born, passed down through the Compact's cellular chain so many times that no one alive remembered who had chosen it or why. I read it, the message, and I walked to my station. At 0614, I sent the activation sequence to my 41 nodes. At 0614 in some seconds, I felt the ridge beneath me shift. Not violently, not dramatically, but with the particular low resonance of a vast mechanism, waking up after a long rest. Then I waited because that was the work. What happened in the next 18 minutes is a matter of record now, and I will give you the record plainly. Across a front of some 11,000 kilometers, relay nodes that had been silent infrastructure for between 30 and 200 years, activated in a cascading sequence that the Compact's designers had called, in their private documentation, the exhale. The Valdran Shelf Aegis was not a weapon in the simple sense. It was a lock. It was a corridor. It was a set of conditions under which the Kethani withdrawal fleet could proceed, and a different, far more specific set of conditions under which it could not. The Aegis did not fire on the fleet. It informed the fleet, in the Kethani's own navigational encoding, in formats that could not be spoofed or misread, that the withdrawal corridor had been closed pending a formal process of reclassification, and that the 9 carriers and 47 support vessels were now operating under its navigation authority. The Kethani fleet commanders had been told, by every source they had ever trusted, that Earth did not have a navigation authority. I imagined the silence on their command decks in those first minutes. I have tried, over the years, not to enjoy imagining it too much. These were soldiers doing a job they had been told was a formality, and the thing that hit them was not an act of war, but something worse. The discovery that they had been operating inside a plan they had never detected, built over centuries, designed to activate in exactly this moment. They were not being destroyed. They were being shown. That is a different kind of thing to absorb. The Kethani commanders sent in the following 4 hours 9 formal demands for the Aegis to stand down. Our navigation authority, a woman named Cyril Davith, who had trained for this specific conversation for 22 years, and whose voice did not waver once on the recordings, received each demand, and replied with same procedural language that the Compact's legal architects had refined across 140 years of iteration. Earth was exercising its sovereign navigation rights. The withdrawal would proceed according to the agreed reclassification terms, which now existed, whether the Kethani had expected them to or not. The fleet was not in danger. The fleet was simply no longer in charge. In the 9th hour of the standoff, one of the Kethani carriers attempted to break the corridor. Our 7th carrier group, the Karen Actual, was waiting for that. I will say only this about the Karen Actual. It was not a large vessel by the standards the Kethani were accustomed to. What it was ready. The Compact's engineering teams had been working on propulsion and weapons integration since before my father was born, and the ship that met the Kethani carrier in those 9 minutes of engagement was the result of 200 years of preparation, distilled into hardware. The Kethani carrier withdrew. It was not destroyed. It was not given the opportunity to test whether it could be. By the end of that day, the withdrawal was proceeding on our terms. The last Kethani vessel cleared our corridor at 1847 the following evening. I watched it go from the ridgeline above my relay stations, in company with the 3 other people in my cell. We did not cheer. We had known each other for 21 years, and we had not once, in all that time, talked about this moment, about what we would feel, what we would say. I think we had all been afraid that if we talked about it, we might not be steady enough to reach it. One of them, a woman named Orith Callender, who had spent 30 years pretending to maintain seismic monitors at the empty place in the sky where the fleet had been, and said quietly that she thought she would like to sleep for a week. We all agreed that sounded about right. That is what a victory built on patience looks like, from where I was standing. 4 tired people on a ridge, watching the sky go quiet, not saying nothing that would be remembered. The ones who would be remembered were already gone. 200 years of them, living and dying inside a discipline so complete that it left no visible seam. They had passed the word to us. We had passed the morning. That was all. That was everything.